Ihara Saikaku offers a titillating and often quite searing portrait of Tokugawa Japan in life of a sensuous woman. It's a remarkable little narration told in the first person of this woman who's never named, who claims to have had some extraordinary sexual exploits. And she gives a little tale. She tells her story as an old woman about how she did all these things. And in the process, gives a remarkable tour of the underbelly of Japan. Well, not even, but there's different stratifications of culture and society of that time, because she starts off as a relatively respectable middle-class woman and slides from there. And there is a sort of happy ending of a sort that you may or may not believe is sincere, but this mechanism, this story, allows for an awful lot of social commentary, portraiture, humor at a lot of points, and just searing criticism. It starts out with these two guys who are on their way, who are traveling, and they get observed by a third guy. And this third guy is sort of telling the story and recalling it. And they, one is very exhausted, and they strike up a conversation, and the third guy is just sort of listening to this. And he says, "Well, you know, I've been." One is decided that because he looks so terrible and is so worn out, that he has been having too much sex, and that this is the problem, and the two friends decide this. And one says that one says basically that you know, oh, I would like nothing better to just keep having sex all the time. And his friend said that, well, what I'd like is the opposite. I would like a country without women. So that we have immediately these two polar positions on the role of women and sex in society. And they're on this little journey, and the third guy follows them, just sort of curious, sort of tagging along after them. It's a little uncertain where they're going, why this guy is following them. It's all kind of mysterious, but they get to this this quiet little area off of a hermitage, and they find this old woman. And we're judging it as a hermitage really only by assuming a lot of surface details. We're deducing, essentially. The area that they're going to visit, it has a lot of temples nearby. It's known as seems to be some sort of a religious center. And then they see this secluded little spot hidden under shrubbery and bamboo, and sort of obscured, and ferns are growing, vines clung to their roofs, their leaves. It's all very natural, and you know, it seems all perfectly wooden. And then they see an old woman, surprised to see an old woman, one whose face the years had given a refined beauty. She seems at peace, she seems happy, and then she invites them in. These two young men who get invited in by this old woman, who starts to tell her story, and it's a very interesting story. She tells about how when she was from essentially a middle class family that was just kind of on the way down. Her father was a minor aristocrat who was kind of hitting the skids, and so the family was falling. It was a time of great social upheaval. This is not uncommon. Families rise and fall in terms of their social status, but it is an indication that in a highly structured society like Japan at this time, there still can be some volatility that can leave certain fractures behind, and certain people might get victimized by this and not be taken into consideration very often. But she talks about how basically she was she got interested in sex at a very young age. She developed a fondness for a young samurai who was of low rank and wasn't good looking, but his writing, even his very first letter, sent me into another world. The priority of writing and the power of it is prioritized here. Little details like that tend to jump out. There's not a particularly clear plot line as the story unfolds, so you have to look to certain symbolic levels to see the action. And so when you see a little detail like that about the power of writing, it's like, oh, okay, something's developing there, and I gotta just squirrel that away in the back of my head as I'm reading. But the affair with the young samurai, and she is a very young girl at this age, gets going, and she gets fired because of rumors. Her employer just doesn't want to deal with the rumors, so he fires her. And after that, she was punished. He ended up dying. It's a little obscure as to how, but this seems to have stimulated something in her, some awareness, some sensibility that was taking her over, and this is her awakening sexuality, that she has, having had this youthful affair. She, it seems, upset perhaps that the young man was, ended up dead, but she seems more upset that, well, perhaps is the sex over now? What other options do I have? And this is introduced in a kind of attenuated to a kind of sleeplessness, anxiety. I could not tell whether I was sleeping or awake. A certain lack of perspective, delusion comes in right around the time of her sexuality, and this suggests that sexuality itself is considered a warping of one's perspective, perhaps, from a religious standpoint, that this is more or less writing from, and this is all being told supposedly by this woman who has found religion of a sort. Sexuality warps the perspective. Sexuality hinders your ability to see clearly. She develops. She goes on. She gets hooked up with a local lord who basically just uses her. She gets sold essentially through a kind of auctioning system that is really quite dehumanizing. She is identified, or she is matched against an agent. Goes around with a picture, with a painting of the perfect woman, and he goes to different agencies essentially and points to the picture and says, what do you have that looks like this? And then other women come and he tries to judge the real woman against the picture. It's like, okay, does my boss want this? And they go through point by point about the different aspects of the image and compare it to the reality. And these are all just simple physical attributes, and they click through so many of them: eyes, eyebrows, teeth, ears, earlobes, hairline, the nape of her neck, her feet, her nails, her toes, her soles, her waist, her hips. Nothing about anything, personality-wise or anything like that, but just strict physical attributes, exterior qualities that this agent is going around looking for. And the objectification is really quite clear. The woman, the narrator, goes through this whole process, which is really quite explicitly laid out in economic terms, and you get a sense of like, oh, well, this is all just commerce. This is all just commodity. Women are objectified as a product that they have to be put on a market for. And the contract that they strike at the end, she actually gets some buy-in on. She got to set the, she said everything was decided on the spot and I got to set the conditions myself. So you get a sense that because that little detail is mentioned, well, the woman is, okay, she's being sold as a commodity, but perhaps that's the only power she has. Her sexuality is her entire worth in this marketplace. And because it has some value, she has value, and she can operate within that as an economic actor. I got to set the conditions myself. It's a little detail at the very end of a paragraph that suggests that, well, wait a minute, why am I being told that? All of this suggests that the individual woman has no authority whatsoever, no value, no worth in this society, that she is simply a collection of, sexual commodities. But she makes the most of what she has. She uses the power of her physical attractiveness to leverage social power. It doesn't say exactly what she got out of it, but just the fact that, well, okay, she had some negotiating ploy there. The deal itself is, of course, probably not all that great, and the situation doesn't turn out all that well for him, for her or him, honestly. She gets picked. She starts having the affair with the local domain lord, and he sort of withers away and dies. He starts popping like herbal pills, presumably to keep up with her. She is quite the experienced sexual dynamo at this point, and he seems to be, well, an older guy, and he needs a little time to recover, perhaps, and having trouble keeping up with the young girl. And so he starts getting sicker and weaker, and it's a very clear and repeated pattern you see throughout, where people like the one guy at the beginning, too much sex bleeds you of your life forces, I suppose is the medical assumption. But on a symbolic level, it is that too much concern, perhaps on a symbolical religious interpretation, too much concern with sexuality, being too involved with sexuality, too much worldly concern in general, contaminates you and ultimately sucks out your life. Sexuality is destructive in this consideration. She ends up as she ends up as the mistress to a monk then, and the monk passage is really quite extraordinary, because having seen, like, okay, she had what was the reaction to her sexuality as a young girl with a local samurai, and she was just a young girl, it was this, it was terrible. And then she had the affair with the domain lord, and she was suddenly like this experienced but younger and sexually rapacious woman who just bled and dry, literally, not quite literally but close. And now you see her in a situation with a monk, and the portrait of the monk's life is just horrifying. And if accurate, it is a scathing critique of religious life, and particularly the religious practices of these monks, because they do not seem to be adhering to terribly many of their vows. For one thing, they are having an awful lot of sex, not just the one monk who basically takes on our narrator, but they all seem to be quite familiar with sexual attitudes and sneaking in sexual partners. Women and young boys. Young boys are, in some cases, it's implied preferred. And our narrator is sort of introduced into that under a semi-knowing prescription. She cuts her hair and pretends to be a boy. She dresses up as a boy so that she can get admitted to the monastery, let's say, and she's allowed in under those pretenses, but it's entirely understood that she is not in fact a boy. And in fact, when interviewing her, essentially, the monk addresses her, well, it's something you women really need to know. Well, when talking about the ability to create a potion that will induce abortions, the monk responds, well, yes, it's something you women really need to know. He is talking about abortions. B, apparently it's a pressing problem in the monastery that women keep getting pregnant, surprisingly. How could that happen? And C, obviously, he is dropping dropping the facade for a second and forgetting that he's supposed to be pretending that he doesn't know that this is a girl. And, it's a funny little moment, but one that just sends chills up your spine because it's also so horrifying. The monk keeps her in essentially a cellar, holds her prisoner, brings her out for sex. She's kept in a tiny little room in the floor under like a hidden trapdoor or something, and she is allowed to come out and go to his bedroom, and that's the extent of her freedom. Tiny little room with a tiny little window and his bed. And that's all she can go. Again, rather horrifying. And she describes it as quite horrifying. And she gets quite depressed. She says, it was depressing, it was sadder, it was just a job, there was no love in it. So she's going through the motions sexually. Now, this may not be perfectly sincere. She may not be particularly honest here, because in the very next paragraph, after talking about how awful the sex is, she says that, well, later I got used to the situation and I even came to enjoy it. That's striking. Is it that she is just so adaptable and can get used to anything? Is that it? I'm not sure. Is it that the sex itself was just even dehumanized the way it is? Is that what's attracting her? Just that basic animal sex that she initially seems to poo-poo, saying, oh, it was just sex, and there's no feeling or thought behind it. Maybe she warms up to that idea. Maybe she likes the animal sex. It's uncertain. There's really no resolution. And you can look at that and say, well, gee, is that a conflict? But then you got to remember, this is all being told by the woman in the in the future, recalling her past. So maybe she's not being particularly honest about the way she's couching this story for these young guys. Unreliable narrator. She does eventually get kind of bored with it. She gets a little frustrated, so she pretends to be pregnant. She starts stuffing stuff into her little outfit and pretending to have a belly. And she goes to the monk and says, "Hey, I'm pregnant." And he kind of flips out and says, "Okay, that's great. There's the door. Get out." He gives her a couple of bucks and sends her home to her family and says, "Okay, now when you're done with this," he doesn't seem to want to know a whole lot of details. "When you're done, you can come back." Okay, because he did sign a contract with her, and she still has some time left on it. So he's very concerned about that. Again, contracts. There is that recurrent theme of a merchant society that runs on contracts. Saikaku was raised in a merchant family. He's familiar with that middle class life of a economy getting going like that, and so all of the values that people espouse, like vows of chastity. They eat forbidden foods. Early each evening, I called in fish peddlers and made suppers of duck meat and with and without bones, blowfish soup, cedar broiled fish, and other fine seafood. They have obviously a lot of sex. They have these seemingly ridiculous lifestyles that they are not supposed to have. So painting this picture gives a very hypocritical note to the monks, but the broader society as well, because in this time of the Enlightenment, of this time, in this period, even in Asia, not just Europe, there is a lot of increased economic activity. People are trading. Ships are coming in and out of the harbors constantly from all other parts of the world, and so merchants are making a lot of money, and all of the old values are being called into question. That merchant quality, or that money-centered economy, let's say, stimulates a lot of social change. And what we see repeatedly is social change, where old values seem to be falling away and newer values are superimposing. We get another image of this in the writing of letters. Again, whenever somebody starts talking about writing a letter, whenever writers start talking about writing, you got to perk up and say, well, okay, what's he really talking about here? And he seems to be maybe self-referencing, maybe bragging a little about the power of writing, and there's some of that here. And in a merchant economy, merchant society, being able to communicate, being able to sway people with words is important, because if all of the natural structures of society seem to be shifting, your ability to affect change in the world, economic change, it's based on talent, and writing is a talent. And son of a gun, our heroine demonstrates some power with writing. She starts off, she gets a job after leaving the monk. She gets a job trying to teach young girls how to do calligraphy, how to have a good handwriting, and teaching young girls. At this point, the woman has some significant baggage on her resume, let's say. So how she gets this job, I'm not sure, but apparently she has a very graceful hand, and so she starts teaching, and that morphs into not only teaching people handwriting, but how to write itself and how to sway people in a letter. And then this develops into romantic Cyrano de Bergerac type stuff, where she is writing letters or promising to write letters for men who are wooing women, and she will help the tongue-tied among them come up with the perfect words that will make their paramour's heart go flitter flutter. And she seems to brag about this a little bit. She seems to like the power. This is a different sort of authority than that she has had before. Before it was just based on her sexuality. Now it seems to be based more on her talent, and she seems to really like this. This, of course, leads to one guy coming to her and trying to set up a deal where she will help him woo some other woman. Of course, they end up in great romantic comedy, almost cliche, they end up involved, and she doesn't seem to like that. She likes the sex, but the attitudes that come out of it. He was breathing heavily as he forced himself on me, and as he began, he took some expensive tissue paper out of his robe and placed it near the pillow. After he finished, he slapped me gentle on the small of my back, apparently thinking I enjoyed it. This is an example of another coarsening effect of sexuality, perhaps, where the pure pleasure of it is somehow downgraded, and there's a kind of distaste there. Now, this, again, unreliable narrator, this does not stop her. She pursues this relationship. I made love with the man day and night. Well, if it was so bad the first time, why'd you go back? It's a fair question, and here again we're into unreliable narrator territory. Can we really take her seriously? When he lost his desire, I strengthened him with loach broth, eggs, and yams, and we continued. So she's just pumping the vitamins into him again, trying to get him going. Yeah, it didn't end well for him. Once again, sex seems to deplete those who engage. There are probably the most remarkable sequence comes when she finds herself among a group of women, and these are the wives of domain lords, or that who the idea is that a domain lord has to have a home district where he has to live like for 1 full year and then come back to the capital, Edo, which is modern day Tokyo, I believe, and spend a year there. So he's essentially splitting his time between the home and the capital. And the wife and children of the Lord need to stay in the capital throughout. So they're kind of like hostages. It's a way of controlling your provincial lords. But you can imagine that there's a fair amount of extramarital adventure for these guys. They are spending a year away at a time, and the strength of their relationship is probably questionable anyway. I'm assuming that most of the relationships or most of the marriages are built on political expediency more than particular individualized romance. But she's hanging out with these women, with the attendants of one of them in particular, and they play kickball. They engage in, she seems to really enjoy the physicality of that. She dresses like in a kind of athletic wear that makes you think, well, are we back in like a gender bending type thing again? Like when she entered the monk's place, there are these little questions, these themes that seem to be teased around underneath the surface, and I'm not sure where Saikaku is going with this, but it's fun to speculate. And then, but the thing is, they end up, there's fractions and tensions and frustrations, and they end up doing what they call a jealousy meeting. And a jealousy meeting is they bring out a dummy that has been made to look like one of the mistresses of the domain lord. And then all the women in this group go up, they meet around the dummy, and then they go up to the dummy and they essentially chastise the dummy as the personification of their own husband's mistresses, and they get all their frustrations out on this mannequin. And here again, you can see an awful lot of objectification. The women are now objectifying one another in this, and it's all for the entertainment of the top woman, the domain lord's proper wife, whose husband is having an affair, and who had this dummy created to look like his principal mistress. And it's somewhat bizarre how the other women are competing, in a sense, to impress the woman, impress the domain lord's wife, by beating up on this other woman of sorts. But it's not another woman, and it's just so bizarre and so hostile and violent that it's uncomfortable to read. They of course, our heroine does makes the greatest impression, and she is sort of favored because of that, for her ability to vent the frustrations of the domain lord's wife. But she pulls back because she feels a little hostile from that. And then, of course, the domain lord hears about this, and he asks the narrator to spy on the wife, and it's just all so distasteful. And now we're getting a little snapshot about how marriages work. After touring through all of these other little segments of society, we're getting an idea of how the institution of marriage, in its hypocrisies and its discomfort, how that works and doesn't work, and how it's really cruel in so many ways, that as the society is becoming more successful, as the society is becoming more financially wealthy, the traditions and the structures of an orderly society seem to be breaking down into a kind of coarseness, into a kind of an ugly going through the motions, like sex without knowing someone. The story itself, as we have it here, does have a few more segments that aren't included in the Norton anthology. One of which is a dream, a hallucination that the narrator has about, I think it's 95 children, an image of 95 children who have lotus flower hats and are covered in blood. And there's some suggestion that these are the abortions she has had in the past. And it's a gruesome image. But again, a sense of like the real cost of sexuality. It's disturbing. And then it ends with another image where she goes to this essentially religious site, and she sees all of these statues of the followers of the particular form of Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, that they're dealing with here. Which is essentially that you will be, after death, you will be reborn in a pure land, essentially the birthplace of Buddhism, India. But it's a kind of a sense of a Christian afterlife, Christian heaven, if you will. But that sense of this world is ugly, but once you get rid of it, you will live in a blessedness. Okay, so she goes and she sees all of these statues of the followers of this, some of the notable ones, and she starts saying, "Oh, well, that looks like," and she starts associating every statue she sees with, well, you know, that looks like somebody I slept with once or twice or a dozen times. That looks like somebody, and that one looks like someone, and that one, and that one, and that one, and that one. And she just sort of adds it all up until she does a little math in her head and calculates that, you know, with this single body of mine, I slept with more than 10,000 men, which is NBA numbers. It's astounding. Is it sincere? I don't know. When she's pointing everybody out, she doesn't say necessarily that, well, I slept with him. I slept with someone like him. And once you're in that like category, once you're in that representational category, you're not really dealing with reality anymore. It's a representation. So how do you really determine the truth of that? How do you determine if that is accurate in any way? A representation can be many, many things. I slept with someone like him, and like him, and like him. Well, is that all the same person, or is that a bunch of other people? There's no way to determine, and she doesn't clarify it. From there, she has an epiphany of sorts and decides that this is going to be, she's going to give up her former life. She has by now, this is another segment that was left out, is as she gets older, she has been reduced again from this steady cascade down the social ladder where she becomes a simple prostitute, and an older one who can no longer attract men. So that's where she is at this stage, where she's looking at all of these statues. And it's at this point that she decides to give up her earthly life of sorts. She is dissuaded from performing suicide, a kind of ritualized suicide, to attain the Pure Land. But she goes and she decides to be a hermit, and she is now a practicing hermit. And this is where we have come in with the two young visitors who have come to visit her. And she's just sitting there and saying, well, you know, yeah, and since then I've been very devout. I've been very pious, and you can see I have been just sitting here, and I am pure as the new driven snow. And who's to say I'm not? Well, she is claiming to be pure as the new driven snow, and you can take her at her word. But remember, her word seems a little confused at different times, and sometimes she seems to be a little iffy on objective truth. She is a she has invited these young men into her house. Okay. I'm sure that's innocent enough. She has been drinking wine with them. There's some troubling patterns here. There's some difficulty, and you're not sure. Is she actually now devout? Is she actually now renouncing her former ways? Is there any way to know? Well, no. Throughout, we've been told that she has been corrupted of sorts by sexuality. It always turns out badly for her. But even within that, she's always going back to it. She's always, and not out of, she never actually really says that, well, you know, I needed to make a buck. It's always more drawn to the physical experience of it, the worldliness of the physical experience of it, the pleasure of it. So there's no real positive way to say that she has renounced anything, or that she recognizes that everything before her were bad. And it's not just about sexuality, it's about the entire culture. Hypocrisy runs throughout, obviously with the monks, obviously with the marriages, obviously with the merchants and the everywhere she went, she was objectified and exploited. And that seems to happen to everyone. And it's a tour of the entire culture through this lens of this story. And it is throughout the culture. And throughout, you're also getting little pieties tossed around, just little asides, little mentions of sayings and adages. And the very first line of the story is a kind of a cliche, kind of an adage, where where it's just tossed out. A beautiful woman, many ages have agreed, is an axe that cuts down a man's life. I don't know what that means. I could dwell on it for a little while, and it might be fun. But the point is, it's just an adage. It's a bumper sticker of sorts that you're supposed to know what it means, and that you get a sense is in the culture, and that the people knowing it are just ordinary people. It's a kind of populist message, a kind of populist belief. And we're told repeatedly throughout different folkways, different all of the herbal remedies and vitamins or whatever. Yams are good for sex. These are all folkways that we're told are very common. And little things like this get dropped throughout the story that makes you think that, well, okay, this story is about the entire culture. This story is about everything going on in that world. And it's a review. It's a tour. It's a consideration. You don't know the sincerity behind it. You don't know what's going on behind it. But all of this is open for consideration. Is it all bad? I'm not sure. Is it all something to be left behind so that you can achieve enlightenment? Maybe. But it's always pulling you back, if it is. It's a complicated story. It's a very rich story. It's a very confusing story at times. But at heart, it's about what we know, what we think we know, what we need to know, and what we can never know. And that makes a good puzzle.